They demoted me for attitude on a Tuesday like it was a weather update. No warning, no performance plan, just my director sliding a one-page letter across the table and smiling like he'd finally solved a problem. HR sat beside him, hands folded, eyes already avoiding mine. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked one question. Can you email me the HR report that supports this? The room went quiet in a way I've only ever heard when someone realizes they've put something in writing they can't take back. I'm a mid-level operations manager at a mid-sized tech company. 8 years in the industry, 4 at this company. Consistent reviews, solid numbers, the kind of employee who doesn't make noise unless something's actually broken. I was never the loud one in meetings. I wasn't the guy with jokes or speeches. I showed up, fixed problems, documented everything, and went home. Which is probably why the word attitude hit so hard. The meeting invite had been vague. Quick sync, 10 minutes. When I walked into the small conference room, my director, Mark, was already there with HR. No laptop, no agenda, just a printed letter face down on the table. That was my first red flag. Mark started talking before I sat down. He said things like perception, alignment, and tone. He said I was technically strong, but difficult to work with. He said my communication style was creating friction. He never mentioned a missed deadline, never mentioned a failed project. Just vibes, just feelings. Then he flipped the letter over and slid it toward me. Effective immediately, I was being moved down one level. Same team, same workload, he said, but less responsibility and less pay. Temporary, he added, if I showed improvement. I read the letter twice. It referenced ongoing concerns raised by leadership, but didn't list a single example. No dates, no names, no incidents. It cited company values without saying how I'd violated them. I felt my pulse in my ears, but I kept my voice steady. I asked if this was considered disciplinary action. HR said it was a developmental step. I asked if there was a performance improvement plan. They said not at this time. I asked what specific behaviors I needed to change. Mark said, it's more about how you show up. That's when I realized something important. They didn't want a conversation, they wanted compliance. So I didn't give them a fight. I asked for documentation. I said calmly, if there's an HR report supporting this, I'd like a copy. And I'd also like my full personnel file. HR's head snapped up for half a second before she looked back down at her notepad. Mark blinked, just once. He recovered quickly, said that HR would follow up, and stood up like the meeting was over. I went back to my desk, demoted, confused, and angry, but also alert. Because in 8 years of corporate life, I'd learned one thing. Vague accusations usually mean someone doesn't want you looking too closely. The attitude narrative hadn't come out of nowhere. Mark and I had been clashing for months, quietly. Not shouting matches, disagreements. He liked fast decisions and clean stories. I liked data and written confirmation. When he pushed to ship something without proper testing, I flagged the risk. When he wanted me to take ownership of a process I didn't control, I said no. Politely, in writing. I'd noticed a shift after one specific meeting a few weeks earlier. Mark had blamed my team for a delay that wasn't ours. I corrected him with a timeline pulled straight from our shared project tracker. He laughed it off in the room, but later that day he slacked me saying I'd undermined him. I replied that accuracy wasn't undermining. It was part of my job. After that, the tone changed. Fewer one-on-ones, shorter replies, feedback that felt more like mood than substance. I started documenting everything without even realizing why. Old habit, insurance. By the end of that demotion day, the shock wore off and something else settled in. Clarity. This wasn't about my attitude. It was about control. That evening, I forwarded the demotion letter to my personal email. I pulled my last 3 performance reviews. I saved screenshots of project approvals. I didn't rant to anyone. I didn't post. I didn't threaten to quit. I just started organizing. HR emailed 2 days later, polite, vague. They said they'd compile available documentation and get back to me. No timeline. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be quick. But I also knew something else. If they were confident in their case, they would have already sent it. HR didn't reply for 3 days. Not even an acknowledgement. No, we're reviewing. No, we'll follow up. Just silence. The kind that feels intentional. By day 4, Mark was acting like nothing had happened. Same slack tone. Same casual check-ins. He even asked if I could support a decision I used to own outright. Same work, less title, less pay. I said yes, because saying no would have been framed as proof. That was the part that stung the most. The trap wasn't the demotion. It was the narrative, waiting behind it. On the 5th day, HR finally emailed. Short message, 2 paragraphs. They attached a single PDF titled Summary. It wasn't a report. It wasn't an investigation. It was a loose collection of bullet points written in passive voice. Perceived resistance to feedback. Challenging leadership direction in group settings. Communication style described as abrupt. No dates, no names, no examples, no reference to policy. No indication anyone had ever raised these issues with me before. I read it twice, then a 3rd time slower. The wording mattered. Described as not documented, perceived, not observed. This wasn't evidence. It was interpretation. So I replied, carefully. I thanked them for sending it. I asked where this summary was stored in my personnel file. I asked which leaders contributed to it. I asked when these concerns had first been raised, and why none appeared in my performance reviews or one-on-ones. I cited the company policy that said disciplinary actions had to be supported by documented coaching or warnings. I CC'd myself. I didn't CC a lawyer, not yet. HR responded the next morning with a new tone, warmer, softer. They said the summary was informal, that it reflected ongoing feedback conversations, that not everything rises to the level of formal documentation. That sentence told me everything. If it was informal, it shouldn't justify a demotion. If it justified a demotion, it couldn't be informal. So I pushed one step further. I asked for my full personnel file, explicitly, including internal notes, manager submissions, and any third-party complaints. I referenced the jurisdiction and the policy again. I kept it neutral, polite, boring. Mark messaged me an hour later. First time since the meeting. Hey, just saw the thread. I feel like this is getting a bit adversarial. That wasn't my intention. I stared at that message longer than I should have. I replied that I was just trying to understand the basis for a decision that affected my role and pay. I said transparency would help rebuild trust. He didn't answer. Over the next week, little things started happening. Meetings I used to attend weren't on my calendar anymore. Decisions were made without my input, then handed to me to execute. Someone asked if I was okay in that careful way people use when they think you're unstable. The label was spreading, then something else happened. A coworker I trusted pulled me aside. Quietly. No drama. He said, "Off the record, Mark's been saying you're hard to manage, that you push back too much." I asked if he'd ever seen me disrespectful. He shook his head. Said no. Said it sounded rehearsed. That night I went back through my emails. Not cherry-picking. Everything. I built a timeline. When feedback appeared, when it didn't. When Mark's tone shifted. When responsibilities were added without authority. When I'd refused to sign off on a rushed change that later caused issues in another team. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't about attitude. It was about friction. I slowed things down. I asked for proof. I created records. And Mark hated that. HR finally sent my personnel file 9 days after my request. It was thick. Performance reviews, offer letters, comp history, training acknowledgments, and buried near the back, a manager's submission dated 2 weeks before my demotion. It was Mark. He'd written that I was resistant to direction, that I struggled with tone, and that I created unnecessary tension by insisting on process over speed. He recommended a temporary step back to reset expectations. No mention of my reviews. No mention of results. No mention that I'd never been warned. What caught my eye wasn't what he wrote. It was what he didn't. There was no HR acknowledgement signature, no follow-up note, no evidence anyone had validated his claims before acting on them. They'd demoted me on a single manager's opinion, and now it was in writing. I didn't react right away. I didn't forward it. I didn't confront anyone. I slept on it. Because once you realize the system is paper thin, the smartest move isn't anger. It's precision. I didn't go to HR the next morning. I didn't forward the file to anyone. I didn't even mention it to Mark. Instead, I sat with it, because for the first time since the demotion, I wasn't confused anymore. The document didn't hurt the way I expected. It clarified. Mark hadn't reacted emotionally in that meeting weeks ago. He'd made a decision. The moment I corrected him in front of others, calmly with data, he stopped seeing me as an asset and started seeing me as a liability. Not because I was wrong, because I couldn't be controlled without friction. That realization changed how I felt about everything. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I started noticing patterns I'd previously ignored. The people Mark praised were fast, agreeable, and vague. They nodded, took notes, and fixed things quietly later. The people who asked questions, who documented, who slowed him down, they didn't last. One had transferred teams. Another had left for personal reasons. At the time, I'd assumed normal turnover. Now it looked deliberate. A few days later, HR scheduled a check-in. No subject line, just a calendar block. The conversation was polite, almost friendly. They asked how I was adjusting, whether I felt supported, whether the role felt clear. I answered honestly but carefully. I said I was doing the work. I said the expectations were manageable. I said I was still trying to understand the basis for the change. HR nodded, took notes, asked if I had concerns about Mark. I said yes, and then I stopped myself. That was the moment I realized something else. This wasn't about convincing HR that Mark was wrong. It was about making the process undeniable. So instead of accusing him, I asked a question. I asked how demotions were typically reviewed, what safeguards existed to prevent subjective bias, whether there was an escalation path if documentation was inconsistent with prior reviews. HR hesitated. Not long, just long enough. They said there was a formal grievance process. Rarely used. They said it could be challenging. They said it might strain relationships. I told them I understood. I asked for the form. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from clarity. Filing a grievance wasn't revenge. It was containment. If I didn't correct the record now, that attitude label would follow me forever. That night, I filled it out. Not emotionally, chronologically. I attached performance reviews, screenshots of approvals, emails where I'd raised concerns professionally and been thanked for it, until I wasn't. I referenced the exact policy language Mark had skipped. I didn't call him malicious. I called the process unsupported. Then I submitted it. 2 days later, Mark called me. First actual phone call since everything started. He sounded calm, but there was something tight underneath. He said he felt blindsided. He said he wished I'd come to him directly. He said HR processes could get messy. I said I had come to him. Repeatedly, I said I'd asked for clarity and documentation and hadn't received it. I said this wasn't personal. It was procedural. He paused, then said something that finally cracked the facade. He said, "You know, not everything needs to be a debate." I replied that accountability isn't a debate. It's a requirement. The call ended politely, coldly. After that, things shifted fast. HR stopped being vague. They started asking specific questions, dates, names, context. They asked Mark for additional documentation. He didn't have any. They asked why there had been no coaching notes, why my reviews contradicted the narrative. why a demotion had been used instead of progressive discipline. Meanwhile, Mark started changing his behavior. He CC'd HR on messages. He summarized conversations in writing. He tried to frame disagreements as misunderstandings. Too late. The most unexpected moment came a week later. Another manager, someone senior, someone cautious, requested a private conversation. He said he'd been contacted as part of a review. He asked me directly whether I felt I'd been treated fairly. I told him the truth, calmly, factually. He nodded slowly and said, "That aligns with what I've been hearing." That sentence landed heavier than any apology could have, because in that moment I understood something fundamental. I hadn't been alone. I'd just been quiet. For the first time since the demotion, I felt steady, not hopeful, not vindicated, grounded. Whatever happened next, the story was no longer being written about me without me in the room. And once that balance shifts, nothing stays buried for long. The shift was subtle at first. HR stopped scheduling casual check-ins and started sending calendar invites with titles like Fact Review and Follow-Up Documentation. People I'd never spoken to before began asking me precise questions about meetings from months ago. Not, how did that feel, but who was present, what was decided, what changed afterward. That's when Mark realized he wasn't managing the situation anymore. He became hyper-visible overnight. Long emails summarizing conversations that had never needed summaries before. Slack messages phrased like legal disclaimers. He started inviting HR to meetings that had nothing to do with policy, as if proximity alone would protect him. It had the opposite effect. One afternoon, he called an emergency meeting with me and HR. No prep, no agenda. He spoke quickly, jumping between points, reframing old decisions as mutual misunderstandings. He said my grievance had caught him off guard. He said he felt attacked. HR didn't interrupt. They let him talk. When he finished, they asked him to provide examples of documented coaching conversations. He said they were informal. They asked how expectations had been communicated. He said verbally. They asked why none of that appeared in my reviews. He didn't have an answer. After that meeting, the atmosphere changed completely. People stopped avoiding me. They didn't rally. They observed, quietly, carefully, like a room that suddenly realizes someone's story doesn't match the walls. Mark's authority began to fracture in small ways. Decisions he used to make unilaterally were delayed pending alignment. Requests he'd pushed through before now came back with questions. One of his proposals was paused because compliance needed additional clarity. That was new. Then came the retaliation attempt. Clumsy, rushed. Mark reassigned one of my projects without explanation and told me to focus on execution. He framed it as support. HR flagged it immediately. They asked why responsibilities were being changed during an active review. He backtracked, said it was temporary, said it was miscommunication. At this point, I barely spoke unless asked. I did my work. I documented outcomes. I let the process run. The real break came when HR expanded the scope. They contacted 2 former employees who'd reported to Mark. Both had left quietly. Both had similar exit notes. Culture fit, communication differences. Neither had filed complaints at the time. Now they were being asked specific questions. Within days, Mark was removed from people decisions temporarily. It was framed as neutral, a standard step. He told the team it was to reduce noise. Everyone knew better. He stopped messaging me entirely. I found out the outcome on a Friday afternoon. HR scheduled a final call. Short. Direct. They said the demotion had been unsupported. They said my personnel file would be corrected. They said the record would reflect that no performance or behavioral violations had occurred. They also said Mark would no longer manage direct reports. They didn't apologize. Corporations rarely do. They didn't need to. That evening I sat at my desk long after everyone else had logged off. The office was quiet in that artificial way it gets when a chapter ends, but the building doesn't know yet. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty. And then slowly, calm. I updated my resume, not as a threat, as a choice. Because once you see how quickly a narrative can be built and how fragile it is under light, you stop confusing stability with safety. I didn't win by outplaying anyone. I won by refusing to disappear quietly. And for the first time in weeks, I slept without replaying the meeting in my head. The reversal was processed quietly the following Monday. No announcement, no apology tour, just an updated letter in my inbox stating that the prior role change had been administratively corrected and would not be considered disciplinary in any form. My title and pay were restored retroactively. My personnel file, HR confirmed in writing, would reflect no conduct or performance concerns. That was it. No one clapped. No one asked questions. Corporate life absorbed it the same way it absorbs everything, by pretending it had always been this way. Mark didn't come back. Not to my team, not to decision-making. A few weeks later, an internal notice went out saying he was transitioning to an individual contributor role. The wording was careful, strategic, but everyone understood what it meant. People started talking to me again like nothing had happened. Some were warmer, some were cautious. A few avoided me completely, which told me more than any congratulation ever could. HR asked if I wanted to continue in my role. I said I needed time, not because I was unsure, but because for the first time the choice was actually mine. During that pause, something unexpected happened. Recruiters started reaching out, quietly at first, then more directly. I hadn't blasted my situation anywhere. I hadn't posted. But when senior leadership changes and compliance reviews ripple through a company, people notice movement, and movement attracts attention. One opportunity stood out. Same level of responsibility, more autonomy, leadership that valued documentation instead of resenting it. I took the interviews slowly, asked questions I wouldn't have dared ask a month earlier. When I accepted the offer, I didn't feel like I was escaping. I felt like I was concluding something cleanly. I gave notice professionally. No speeches, no references to the grievance. HR handled the exit paperwork with unusual speed. My manager, Mark's former peer, thanked me for how I'd handled a difficult situation. I nodded and let that be enough. On my last day, I cleared my desk and took one last look at the conference room where it had started. Same table, same chairs, same silence. But I wasn't the same person walking out. I'd learned something I wish I'd known earlier. In corporate life, attitude is often a substitute word. It doesn't mean anger or disrespect. It means friction. It means you don't bend easily. It means you ask for proof. And sometimes that makes you inconvenient. But inconvenient doesn't mean wrong. If I had argued that day, if I had raised my voice or stormed out, the story would have stuck. If I had tried to be liked instead of precise, the label would have followed me. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I stayed still long enough for the truth to catch up. Now, when people ask me for advice, I don't tell them to fight back. I tell them to document, to understand the process better than the person using it against them, to remember that calm isn't weakness, it's leverage. And most importantly, I tell them this. If someone ever tells you your attitude is the problem, ask them to put it in writing. Because the moment they have to explain themselves on paper, the balance changes. And sometimes that's all it takes.